Kettlebell Flows. What are they and should you be doing them? So Kettlebell Flows seem to be, I'm not going to say all the rave, but they're definitely gaining a lot of traction among, whatever, in the kettlebell world, I guess would be a word. So I want to talk about today if you should be doing kettlebell flows or not. Now, what I'm not going to do in this video is I'm not going to bash or critique another man's work. That's something we don't do here on this channel. There are many fit fluencers out there that do that, or just people in general. I think that's very weak, very effeminate. So we don't bash other, this one, I don't know, call it a pet peeve, call it a core value, is the criticism of another man's work. I think men do that because they don't know how to create content on their own. So their content is bashing other guys. So we don't do that on this channel. And we're gonna get into the meat. So rant over. Kettlebell flows, should you be doing them? So as I mentioned, I'm not gonna bash them. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna give you some pros and cons. And then from there, you can make up your own mind. You can make the decision for yourself. So if you haven't seen these kettlebell flows, you can do a YouTube search here and you see guys like juggling and flipping kettlebells around and changing directions and doing all this. I mean, it looks great, right? It looks cool. And there's no doubt you get a great cardiovascular benefit, a good strength benefit, and you build some athleticism, no doubt. But let's talk about some of the benefits. And this is just me, like outside looking in, because I've done some kettlebell juggling way back in the day, They provide, some random acts of variety. So back in one of our videos, I talked about, ordinary time training versus on-mission training. And ordinary time training is those cycles, the training time in between cycles. So you can't stay on a very structured, detailed training protocol indefinitely. Like, you need some breaks to break up the monotony. And planned training protocols can be difficult to follow if you travel. Like if you have a high travel like lifestyle, or maybe you're gonna be on a family vacation, it can be difficult to stick to a structured deadlift protocol. Like I gotta deadlift this much, very structured, very difficult. And that's where ordinary time training comes in. You can work on skill practice, grease the groove, whatnot. And I think this is somewhere, I think this is where kettlebell flows would fit in, would be in ordinary time. So they provide random acts of variety. They allow you to work on multiple skills at once, and they can break up the monotony of training that does creep in when your training is just super simple, deadlifting a barbell every day, swings and get-ups. For me, I'm in a season right now where I'm just training the jerk, and sometimes I'm just training the snatch only, and that goes on for months at a time. And sometimes that can be monotonous. So things like kettlebell flows, flipping things, doing juggling, and working on skill training, that has a good place there. And the second benefit there is a synergy of strength. So you're incorporating many athletic movements, changes of direction. So you're working on, what do they call that? SAC training, right? Speed, agility, quickness. You're getting some strength work in. You're getting obviously cardiovascular work in. So that's another benefit there of incorporating kettlebell flows into your training. I think another really good thing that kettlebell flows do is it allows you to train and practice in multiple planes of motion. So we've got 3 primary planes of motion. We have the sagittal plane, and that's forward and backward movements. Okay, so you've got this. Imagine this imaginary, piece of glass, if you will, that kind of cuts you from left to right. Okay, and so think of that sagittal plane, like right now, as I'm walking, I'm in the sagittal plane, forward and backward movements. So sagittal plane movements would be kettlebell swings, kettlebell snatches, running, sprinting, that sagittal plane movements. If we only train in that plane of motion, and then life demands all 3 planes of motion. You need to know how to be able to turn, move, right? Cut and move and whatnot. You gotta be able to do those things without getting hurt. So if we only train in that sagittal plane, like all we do is like like kettlebell swings, or all I do is jerks, like no matter what, yeah, things can go south, pretty quick, unexpectedly. The second plane of motion, well, these aren't in any particular order, but the second plane of motion would be the frontal plane. So the frontal plane of motion would be, imagine that same piece of glass kind of cutting you down the middle, but is separating you from front to back. So that plane of motion, think of lateral movements, moving side to side. So you can think of like skipping side to side, shuffling your legs. That would be frontal plane movements. And you see people swinging kettlebells side to side and whatnot. That would be an example of frontal plane movements. And then the third movement planes, we got transverse. The transverse plane of motion is like turning and twisting. So think of the transverse plane is like swinging a baseball bat, swinging an axe, throwing a baseball, throwing a football, swinging a hockey stick, swinging a golf club, like that rotational force there, those are our sagittal planes. And so that's one of the benefits of Kettlebell Flows, is that they incorporate all of these planes of motion. So what are the cons, right? So just recap the benefits. They provide random acts of variety. They allow for the synergy of multiple skills, training, strength and endurance, and working on athleticism, right? Building that high skill. And the third one would be they allow you to train multiple planes of motion, right? Frontal, sagittal, transverse planes of motion. So a lot of great benefits there. Now the cons are the exact opposite. The cons are the exact opposite. So it's one of these, like what I would call a paradox of performance. The paradox of performance would be, yeah, they allow you to do all these things, but sometimes because of these things, they're not a great idea. So if you're new to strength training, I think this is where we can compare Kettlebell Flows with traditional strength training. If you're a beginner, I would start with traditional strength training. We don't want to be doing random acts of variety. One of my last videos was, assistance exercises. And let's get strong in the one thing, versus having all these variables and very few constants, like results are not predictable, okay? And so sometimes random acts of variety, too much. This is something else I talked about in the last video, was we need simplicity. Simplicity leads to repeatability. Repeatability leads to consistency. So if we're doing random acts of variety, and that's kind of like our first, getting our foot wet, our first exposure to strength training with a kettlebell is we start doing these kettlebell flows, these random acts of variety. Well, we've got too many variables and not enough constants in our training. And so if and when we do get results and we're doing this, we're not sure what actually got us the result because we've got all these variables. And also, if you're a dad, if you're a parent, and you're just starting to get back into strength training, maybe you've been off for a while, kind of let yourself go, that happens, but now you're getting back into the groove, I don't recommend jumping right in and doing random acts of variety. Instead, I would work on keeping your training as simple as possible, choosing one or two exercises, one or two skills/disciplines, and making that the focus of the training. Learn how to deadlift for a while. Then maybe progress to learning how to clean a kettlebell, then learning how to press it. Maybe start incorporating a squat, maybe incorporating a lunge. Focusing on building one discipline at a time. I'm working on some content around, the core thing that holds our academy together is discipline. And when I say discipline, we don't talk about like just suck it up and do the work. We have a system that teaches men how to build discipline. And there are particular rules and frameworks around building a discipline. And one of those rules is practicing one skill and one discipline at a time. So if you want repeatable results and you're just getting back into the game, you're just starting to strength train, or maybe you're starting you're taking on a new training protocol, focus on one discipline at a time. So that would be one of the cons of Kettlebell Flows, is too many moving parts, too many random pieces. Which is the exact opposite of it provides random acts of variety. And that leads to point number 2. So if the benefit was the synergy of performance and the synergy of skills, it allows me to train strength and endurance and mobility and agility and quickness. It allows me to do all those things. Again, too many moving parts. So that could hinder your progress if you're new and you're getting back into the game. So the first one is too many random acts of variety, too many things, too many moving parts. That leads into training too many attributes at one time. So one of our rules of discipline is training one discipline at a time. The same would go for training one attribute at a time. I'm gonna give you some examples of that. And the third benefit was it allows you to train multiple planes of motion. Okay, that's where a lot of the athletic type stuff comes in. So we're talking high skill level here now. Well, high skill can sometimes get us into trouble if we don't have a foundation. So what would the solution be? Well, this is in the academy, we teach something called the performance progression pyramid, performance progression training, where we work on one discipline, one skill at a time. So this is based on something that the National Academy of Sports Medicine has an example of this. They've kind of coined the term the optimum performance training like model, right? And that's building a foundation of stability, right? And so the first three are a foundation of strength. So we got stability, strength endurance, hypertrophy or muscle building. Then you get into maximal strength training, and then you get into power training. And that maximal strength training and power training, that's like the top of the pyramid. That's where we start getting into training high skills. Power training is like high skills. That's athletic movements. That's speed, agility, quickness, all that's happening there. But oftentimes we start, so if we look at Kettlebell Flows, they kind of start there at the very top of that pyramid. They're working on change of direction, speed, agility, quickness, all that's happening right out of the gate. So I recommend taking a performance progression approach and learning one thing at a time. So this is one of the frameworks that we operate with our students with. Another framework's like, you can think of these two different frameworks and one is embedded in the other. You can think of these two different frameworks as one is like, 30,000 foot view, and then the other is like 5,000 foot view, right? So if we look at the second framework and we go back like 30,000 foot view, we just got 3 levels to this framework. And the performance progression training is embedded in this 30,000 square foot view. So if we're looking at this 30,000 foot view, we've got fundamental movements. What are fundamental movements, right? So we can look at our 7, movement patterns, right? Hinge, squat, push, pull, rotation, gait, carry. We can look at all those, like let's get those fundamentals down and let's address them one at a time. Let's spend some time working on our hinge, working on our deadlift. Then let's work on, rotation. So let's work on, this is where the get up comes into play. Get up is great. This is why this Simple and Sinister is a brilliant program by Pavel, because you've got your sagittal plane movement with the swing, but then the get up, you're training frontal plane, you're training transverse plane, you're training all planes of motion within the get up. So this is why you could do a program like, Simple and Sinister indefinitely, because it hits all planes of motion. Building those fundamental movements, okay, that would be stage 1. Stage 2 would be building fundamental performance. This is where the performance progression training would come in. So when we address fundamental performance, that's where we're working on building a foundation of strength. We're working on building strength endurance. Then once we've done that, we can look into building some muscle, then building maximum strength, then getting into power training. And that power training would be the last level. And that's functional, I believe that would be functional skill. So that functional skill is where we get into, people call this sport-specific training, even though there's no such thing as sport-specific training. But you can call this, we've got GPP, general physical preparedness, which would be like performance skill, learn how to deadlift, getting strong, building a foundation. Then you've got SPP, specific physical preparedness. And this is where we begin to work on building those high skills. So if we're looking at, let's say jiu-jitsu, I always like to look at things through jiu-jitsu eyes. If we're looking at jiu-jitsu, that's a high skill. Well, if you're a dad that started training jiu-jitsu, your strength training off the mat should be focused on fundamental movements and fundamental performance, not more high-level skill, because you're going to be getting that from jiu-jitsu. And so this is how guys can bump into injuries in jiu-jitsu, because they're starting at that top of that pyramid. They're working on high skill first, then they bump into injuries, and then they're kind of having to reverse engineer and go back to the beginning. The same thing would be for strength training with kettlebells. We wouldn't want to start, learning how to swing and snatch a kettlebell right away. That would be high skill. We've got to build the performance. We've got to build the fundamentals underneath that. That's going to support the high skill. So if you're trying to build a stronger, leaner, and more capable body, kettlebell flows can play a part of that. Only after you have built a foundation of fundamental movements, squatting, deadlifting, pressing, lunging, building in rotation, carry, gait, building those in. Once you've built those fundamental movements, then you can start stepping to the next level and building fundamental performance. And that's navigating what we call the performance progression pyramid. Knowing when and how to train for strength, endurance, muscle building, maximal strength, power. And then that last phase is the athletic training, the high skill. Kettlebell flows as some specialized variety kind of mixed in. Something to break up that monotony of training. You start getting into kettlebell snatching and some of those, for me, I love kettlebell jerks. Get into those athletic movements, but only after you set the fundamentals, okay? So that's it. I think kettlebell flows can play a role in your strength training, but they should be a very, very, very small slither of your training. That's something that we would categorize in ordinary time type training to break things up for 2, maybe 4 weeks, probably closer to 2 weeks. And then you get right back into traditional strength training. Traditional strength training should be probably 90% of your focus. And that is what allows you to build a stronger, leaner, more capable body so you can do more of what you enjoy. If this video helped you out, be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you can be notified about more strength training tips.